So once again, it's going back in, trying to find and re-establish your shadow shapes. And really squinting. So what squinting is going to do is it's going to suppress your value range. So you're going to easily see what you can put into shadow and what you can put into light. If in doubt, squint, simplify, and go back to those larger pools of light and dark. Still working with straights, but just trying to find a little bit more specific placements. So again, when it comes to drawing features, as I'm not looking at I'm not worried about the fact that I'm painting an eye as such. I'm painting light and dark, and the eye hopefully should come organically through that if I get those relationships correct. Really sort of looking at comparative measurement on where things are. So for example, where's the tip of the nose in relation to the ear? Where does it fall in relation to the eye on this side? And I started darkening my mid-tone as I realised it needed to get a fair bit darker, certainly as the light turns away from the light source a little bit. So for example, under the cheekbone, there's quite a considerable angle change. When you get a much darker, and a good way to check how light or dark things need to be is by establishing your value range. And I'm doing that by hitting our lightest lights, which are the highlights. I can see that my highlights up here aren't jumping off in the same way they are in nature, and therefore I've got to darken the base tone around it. And obviously whilst I'm darkening, I'm also continually looking to see how I can edit those shapes to be a little bit more accurate and specific. So starting to lose the shapes a little bit. So what I do is I go back, really try and re-establish those shapes. 90% of the information we're going to be putting down is along a contour edge or a shadow edge. So getting those shapes as specific as possible, regardless of how long that takes, is going to be so key. So now it's important for me to really establish our value range, hit our darks, and you'll find that probably as you progress through the painting, you probably have to continue re-hitting these, re-establishing them. But it's always good to go in and be bold, and often you'll probably find, or I find I end up having to hit the darks a little bit darker than I initially sort of believed. So keep in mind, black's quite a thin pigment, so you're going to need a fair amount of it. And at the moment I'm not too concerned about the highlights on the hair. They're going to be darker than all the lights anyway, because although that they're highlights within the hair, because they're surrounded by that sort of dark of the black of the hair, they register to us as lighter, because ultimately that's how we often see tone is in relation to what is directly around it, which is quite tricky when you're painting, because obviously as you're painting you want to be viewing them in relation to the whole image rather than just its sort of local surroundings. Once again, just trying to re-establish the shapes a little bit more, see what I can do. I can see quite easily now that the nose needs to get a little bit longer. I can also then need to get rid of the highlight on the tip of the nose as it was in the wrong spot. So even when you're putting in highlights, those initial marks you put down may not be the ones which last till the end of the painting. You're using them as a gauge for not only placement but for tonal structure of the painting. So at this point whilst we're constantly going back to that sort of linear contour around the shadow edge and contour edge, we also want to be building it up a lot more through tone. And so you're looking for tonal relationships, certainly around the contour. And I'm not that fussed about sort of smudging things around if I think they're in the wrong spot. So again, I knew that mid-tone was too light, so it gives me the opportunity to darken it and also to find the front plane of the head. So to really try and find the angle of the nose, I want to relate it to where certain parts of the nose are in relation to the brow. So for example, I can really have a look at where this nostril sits in relation to the brow and the eye above it, which should help me place it a little bit more accurately and get the relationship between nose and eyes a little bit better. Then I'm also going to use placement of the eyes to figure out where the corner of the mouth is. And I think one of the sort of common mistakes people make when painting or drawing mouths is they have this sort of sharp contour over every section of the mouth, when often it's a lot more subtle, because actually the turning away from the form is far more subtle. So don't get caught up with the idea of sort of essentially the local colouring of the mouth. Really just try and see it as, how is that form turning away from the light? If he was a marble sculpture, what separation would we see? So now that I've got my darkest dark in, which I will probably just quickly re-hit again. Now at this point in proceedings, where I'm roughly happy with the general placement of features, this is when I can start to look more at the planes of the head. And this is when those extra premixes would start to come in. So the reason I didn't go in with 4 or 5 different premixes on my palette is because I needed to get to this point first before I can really start thinking about trying to sculpt out those different planes. Obviously, the lightest parts of the portrait are going to be the parts facing most directly to our light source. And as you're placing them, personally I like to place them a little bit more opaquely than a lot of the paint we've got down so far. And then we can start to really find where the form turns. So under the zygomatic bone, the cheekbone, turns away from the light source, so it becomes a lot darker. To start to establish these relationships, because obviously if this tone here and this tone here are the same, what that starts to suggest is that they're at the same angle towards the light, which they clearly aren't. So we know that the neck needs to get another layer of paint on to turn away. So I'm just placing where those highlights are, and we're going to refine those shapes in a second, but just making sure the moment we know where those essentially lighter or lightest lights are. So what I need to do, really make sure that tonally what I'm painting is making sense to where the form is in relation to the light source. So when you're doing this, it's really important to squint, to simplify what you're seeing. And bear in mind, not all transitions are going to be the same. Certainly when it comes to stuff like the hair, the brow, the beard, there is going to be a lot of variation within that. So this is the kind of point where you start to think more about variety starts to come in. And I'm still painting in a very sort of broad, simple way. I'm not putting a huge amount of variety down, but it is just trying to figure out where those key shifts are. So whilst I'm starting to get a little bit more sense of understanding of tone within the head, the relationships between the background and the head have slightly changed. So I need to re-establish those relationships. And I'm going to do this with a bit drier paint because it's quite a thin pigment. The only pigment out of the three which actually has, a huge amount of body to it is the white. And for most of the backgrounds, I'm not using a huge amount of that, so I don't want to thin it down too much by adding much more oil to it. And if you were working over a couple of days, you could let this dry. It'd be a lot easier then to paint on top of. We're going to see how much we can do today with this sort of wet into wet. So when there were parts of the form and its relationship to either the background, a shirt, neck to hair, if you've got a girl with long hair or something like that, is if you can't see an edge clearly and they're lost into a shadow, don't try and sort of arbitrarily find it. Paint what you can see.